In these first chapters, we've talked about hunting and gathering, also known as foraging, about horticulture, and now about pastoralism or animal herding. And I want to take a little tiny bit of time, maybe a lot of time, to reflect here on these three modes and why they're so important and why these chapters are kind of crucial to our understanding of the world. And one of the reasons, one thing I want to think about here or talk to you about is how these chapters, while in some ways I've critiqued parts of them because they have a little bit of a progressivist line, but in general, they tend to readjust our typical thinking about how humans became humans, about the history of humanity, these sort of deeply embedded stereotypes that show up on television and the internet and our video games about what I will call the ascent of man. Basically, how man became better and better over time. And so the prevailing stereotype about the world is that we began our lives as caveman, as man the hunter. And man the hunter was going off and hunting those wild animals and bringing back a big mammoth for some people, his family in a cave, and it was very man and it was very hunter. And the idea is somehow that man the hunter, because he was hunting those wild animals, then was able to corral them and ride them and dominate them and put them into pens. And then we became man the herder. And so there's this idea that from man the hunter, we become herders. And now we have the animals under our control and we're riding them and we're domesticating them when we're in control of the herds instead of having to chase them all around. Now we make them move around for us. From man the herder, it was thought that then man became farmer because all those animals would be pooping right around the camp. And so all of a sudden, all this all these seeds and stuff are starting to grow. And inadvertently, man decides, well, maybe smart man decides that they're going to start farming now and further settle down. And from that, we have, of course, civilization, and we become man the scientist who can figure this all out and tell us about human history and do PowerPoints and become smart and be a scientist. And that is how things worked. And like I said, this may not be told to you explicitly, but it underlies a whole bunch of our basic thinking about social evolution. For those of you who've been in other anthropology classes, it corresponds to this idea that bands turn into tribes, turn into chiefdoms, turn into states, or it corresponds to an idea that savages become barbarians, become civilized. This idea of an underlying evolutionary progression that is linked to our subsistence and our way of dealing with the world, and also our control over nature, right? The idea that people progressively rise out of nature and become assertive and controlling of it, first domesticating animals, controlling the animals, then controlling the plants, and then controlling the world from the vantage point of science. Now, I don't want you to get this too stuck in your head. It's already there because that's what popular culture teaches us. It turns out it's all wrong. So I want to talk here about, what really kind of happened, our best archaeological and historical evidence for the way these phases kind of developed and who was responsible for them or who was the key participants of this. So we didn't talk about it in this class, but some people actually speculate that for many years of human history, we weren't really hunting and gathering. We were doing something more like scavenging, like going in and sweeping in where other animals had killed, say, a carnivore, and getting the bone marrow using rudimentary stone tools. Now, I put a question mark there because there's been debates about, to what extent early humans and our human relatives were scavengers. But in any case, we can be sure that this was what we might call an earlier phase. Your textbook calls it the earlier phase of hunting and gathering, developed uh, developed in Africa, and really a key point of human emergence. From that point, there's a kind of further refinement of hunting and gathering, and the scavenging is not so much when people, figure out different ways to trap, snare, hunt animals, the techniques used to do that, the techniques of hunting and gathering become more sophisticated. Again, this happens within Africa. And then it is what we talked about is the key strategy for how humans spread all over the world and adapt to different environments where we wouldn't even think they would be able to adapt, to be able to do anything, like the Arctic environment or like the Australian desert tropical environment. People are able to live in these areas, places where you wouldn't think humans would be able to live, and to transform them and manage them in ways that we don't even quite understand today. This is still a strategy, and again, there's not necessarily an inevitable transition here. People go back and forth and are interconnected between these things, but after hunting and gathering, emerging certain horticultural societies. So the first thing we think about in terms of how this historically emerged is the domestication of plants. Now you'll notice here that the word man has disappeared because, in fact, we should emphasize, as we did in the last class, the importance of women in all of these phases of life, including providing most of the calories in many hunting, gathering and hunting groups, most likely contributing an enormous amount to plant knowledge when horticulture develops. So that's the contribution of all members of society is extremely important for how humans do their thing. Obviously, you in some ways need to have domesticated plants in order to then have what we'll read about in the next chapter, more intensive agriculture, more intensive plantings. But again, there's no necessary transition. You can keep on doing horticulture, or you can combine, as we talked about, horticulture with hunting and gathering, or combine agriculture with hunting and gathering. But certainly in terms of the historical and archaeological record, it is agriculture which emerges after horticulture. Now, we're wondering here, where does pastoralism come in? Relationship, remember those people who are digging canals and irrigation, they're in relationship to agriculture, and they need agriculture in order to do their thing. So we have the emergence of what we call specialized pastoralism or animal herding, but it only emerges after agriculture. And even the pastoralists, Jim, what are they eating most of the time? Grain and bread. So obviously they're getting that from somebody, and it's probably the farmers they are trading with all the time. And so there's this symbiotic relationship, right, or mutual interaction between the specialized animal herders, the pastoralists, and the agriculturalists. They are trading with each other. And so this form of life does not actually emerge. It doesn't emerge right after man the hunter. It emerges after agriculture. Now, one time in Intro to Anthropology, I have to write this down, of course, I got really excited about this, and I graphed out my whole understanding of what human life had been like. So dark. So in my idea is we have all these emerging out of this scavenging, gathering, and hunting pattern. We have people who became hunters and gatherers. Some people became horticulturalists, combining different things. We talked about mixed farming. Oh, actually, they talked about mixed farming on page 131, that in different areas, they would have domesticated plants and domesticated animals, and they would use them. And it is from that mixed farming that then you have this separation of different societies into specialized pastoralists and specialized agriculturalists. That sometimes happens and it sometimes doesn't. And sometimes people go back and forth and combine these things. Some of these things change over generations. Some of these change over a lifetime of a person or a society. Some of them change seasonally. There are people who are more nomadic in the summer and more settled in the winter, look more like agriculturalists in the summertime, but more like pastoralists in the wintertime. I'm just trying to impress upon you that there is no inevitable emergence, and humans have combined and recombined these strategies for getting food in all kinds of different ways. And for the most part, all of these have been fairly sustainable in terms of being able to work over time or over centuries. Obviously, there's been some times where people tried to do things in different habitats and they didn't work out, but they weren't sort of wide scale environmental disasters or catastrophes. People just kind of moved on and figured out something else to do, and the earth did its own thing as well. So I think that these three chapters are hugely important in setting a kind of baseline and kind of hopefully reorganizing our ideas or our pre-existing ideas about how people developed as people. Now, I also want to talk about these three chapters in terms of how in the imagination of people, these people are appearing today in our world, or how people have sort of imagined these three forms of life in the popular world. So I did a little, sort of looking for images of, say, a hunter and gatherer. So I guess I would say in the olden days, like about, say 20, 30, 50 years ago, people would have a pretty bad stereotype of hunting and gathering. They would say that it was inefficient, that these were people who were just chasing animals around, that they didn't have any leisure time, that they were kind of like wild out there, and people were pretty down on them. In today's world, something strange has happened, or I don't know if it's strange, perhaps partially because of anthropology and the fact that anthropology has re-examined some of these stereotypes about hunter-gatherers and told us that they actually don't have to work as hard, and it's good for us to move around, and it's good for us to have a much more varied diet with a lot of natural foods and not so many processed stuff. And so the person who adorns this article was a person who had gone to the Hadza and tried eating berries and porcupines and different things, and was like, yeah, this is really great. This is awesome. We should all be more like the Hadza. So I think at least in today's world, if I read it correctly, there are a lot of people who are trying to, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle has in some ways been perhaps over-romanticized, if anything, and we have to kind of figure out, we have to de-romanticize it. I don't know if anybody ever got down on the horticulturalists. It's hard to imagine people got mad at horticulture people. Sometimes they would, because it was described as sort of we talked about in the last class, slash and burn agriculture, where people would go in and burn parts of the forest down. Doesn't look very nice to do, and so people would get down on it because it looked like deforestation. And it was also, people would get down on it because they thought it wasn't as efficient as agriculture, and so it looked kind of lazy and inefficient. And we're like, yeah, if you just plow that up with a tractor and put those chemicals in, you're going to get a lot more yield out of that land. So don't be so lazy. Nowadays, I think I got this picture from our own neck of the woods, where people are trying to learn about traditional horticulture, and they're going to go plant a traditional horticultural garden. And so, if you go down to your, even if you go down to your lawn today, people are like, no, I don't want to mow my lawn so much. I'm going to dig it up and put in some native plants, and we're going to have butterflies and sunflowers and birds are going to be all around, and which is all to the good. But I think in today's world, the horticulture is getting a little bit of a comeback, so that's nice too. Not sure what people think about pastoralists these days. Historically, they were much more nomadic. So they make a distinction, and we'll talk about industrial animal herdings. They make a distinction between traditional nomadic pastoralism and what we know of as cattle farming, where the animals are all grouped together in pens and stuff. So traditionally, these were pretty highly mobile people. In fact, they were kind of in some ways, well, Amanda, you said they combined the nomadic lifestyle of the hunter-gatherers. Some people got down on these pastoralists for being so nomadic. Who gets down on them? Why do they get a bad rap? Why don't we like these pastoralists moving around? Both the government and missionaries don't like them so much. It's like I said, it's like people would see, they said that both the Christians and the government and the Christian missionaries in this part of the world saw this nomadic lifestyle as being somehow backward or primitive. And so if you settle them down, right, you make them stay still so we can talk to you and we can, give you the teaching, the Bible, and if you're the government, so we can tax you. Got to make them stay still. So a lot of people see nomadic people in general as an indication of being kind of backward. We also, I think we also get down on the pastoralists because the animal herders are very close to their animals. Maybe sometimes they make us a little squeamish because they're so close to them and they do things that look kind of disgusting. Right, Liv? Yeah, like drinking their blood.
We should try that.
You think we should try that? So you're in the camp of, why don't we? Why don't we have more blood sausage in our lives, is what you're basically saying. I mean, there are peoples, obviously, who use this, but yeah, we don't tend to in our society. But this might make us a little squeamish if somebody's just going in and tapping a cow or something for blood. That just makes it's kind of looks weird. I once assigned a classic anthropology book they discuss in here called The New Air by Evans Pritchard, and he talks about cattle herding, and he was talking about the kids just like playing with the cows and being out there in the cow dung, and they just take a little milk when they wanted it right from the cow, and playing with the cow piss and everything, and people got really kind of squeamish about it. We're not very close to our animals here. We usually like to find them in little packages, and if we're gonna have blood, we want it all packaged up, we don't want to actually get it ourselves. That sounds yuck. So, I don't know. I mean, have you ever personally butchered an animal? The other thing about the pastoralists is that, they are, unlike the hunter-gatherers, they are often trying to increase their herds. They're trying to multiply these animals, and you often have animals that multiply quite a bit, and so you can increase the herds. And so if you look at the picture of this, one of the things they say is that cattle farming is seen as one of the world's worst environmentally destructive activities, devours resources, pollutes groundwater, and is a climate killer. And look at that, you can see they're all looks like they're turning the place into a desert, right? So I think that in the popular imagination, at least, pastoralists are not having a good run. The other thing about pastoralists, is well, Jim, what do they have a reputation for being able to do back in the olden days? And by olden now, I mean about 1,000 years ago. Huh? Well, they're fearsome warriors, right? They're able to sweep, this is a picture of a depiction of Genghis Khan, right? So they're in the popular imagination, they're often seen as sort of the barbarians who are sweeping across the plains and about to raid your village and take your women and take your crops and do all these things. And that is, there has been this kind of classic dichotomy, especially in Eurasian societies, between those that were based upon being a nomadic warrior and those that were based on settled agriculture. And the historians usually lived in the places that were in the settled towns. And so the stories that we have about the nomads are all getting down on them because they were always the ones coming and raiding and being the barbarians at the gates, so to speak. The other kind of stereotype that we have about pastoralists is a quote, as a saying that Jim, you flagged here, that is supposed to describe their kinship organization. I against my brother, I and my brother against my cousin, I and my brother and my cousin against the stranger. So, the ideology here is we're all out for ourselves, right? Everybody, I'm all on my own. So I against my brother. If I have to compete with my brother, I will. By the way, it is very guy oriented. I against my brother. But if our cousin is getting in here, then I'm going to unite with my brother against that cousin, because that's a different group now. And now me and my brother are getting together against my cousin. And then if somebody's coming in from outside, a stranger, then it's me and my brother and my cousin, and we're going to fight if a stranger is coming in. And so the idea here is sort of a constant, obviously a constant competitiveness, but the idea is that this is the way that kinship worked, and that united people together so that you could still be a fearsome fighting force if you needed to be. Now, this is perhaps more of a stereotype and more of an ideal than a reality. And I want to go back to that cattle farming quote, because if you look at the full quote behind that picture, I hit it at first, it's actually an article about how, if you look in the larger context, these pastoralists can be stewards of the environment. And so they say that, yes, cattle farming as an industrial activity can be quite harmful. But if you look over the centuries or over the millennium, the pastoralists have actually been in areas where other people couldn't be, and they're actually pretty good at conserving those ecosystems. So, what is happening here? Basically, pastoralism is probably going to work best when you have these different ecological niches. If they're in the places that aren't so good for intensive agriculture. So this is what we mean by an ecological niche. A place that there are some places that are they got more rainfall, the temperatures are better. It's just good for planting things. And there are some places that aren't so good for planting things. Now, usually the places that the pastoralists they might be too high up in elevation. So for example, in lots of mountainous areas, there are parts of the mountain range where you can grow things up to a certain elevation, but after that, it's not very good for crops. And so these can be places where the pastoralists can put their animals, their herded animals, not in large numbers, but you can have herding animals survive in places that are not so good for agriculture, or places that are too dry. And so, I mean, For example, we have put a lot of intensive agriculture in the western and southwestern United States. It may not be the best place to do agriculture because it requires so much irrigation and water. It may be a better place to do what has traditionally been as ranching or animal herding or pastoralism. So as long as you have this kind of ecological niche symbiosis where people are doing agriculture in the places that make sense to do agriculture and doing pastoralism in the places that are doing pastoralism and they can be connected to each other, this can work pretty well. There's also the seasonal migrations. So during the summertime, you're growing your crops and you harvest them in the fall, let us say, and then you have a bunch of corn stalks around, and we don't really eat the corn stalks, but you can bring in some sheep and they can eat the leftovers, the chaff of the wheat. And so, there'd be these, again, sort of symbiotic relationships between the people who farm and the people who herd. And this could be said they occupy a different ecological niche. Now, you might have been confused, Liv, because they say that we should be careful with going too overboard on these ecological niche or niche concept, because it's one thing to talk about birds and their niche, but humans often just will plow up a bunch of land or do something to it. And so to call it an ecological niche that we're occupying might be not exactly right. And so it relates to what we talked about is whenever we're talking about human ecology, we are also talking about political ecology. For various reasons, humans might quickly transform and change a niche. Let's just say the Southwest of the United States, the irrigation and the canals and the large dams and various things that have been put in have completely transformed that landscape. And so it is not the same ecological niche that it might have been 100, 200, 1,000 years ago. The other thing about pastoralists, which is worth thinking about a little bit, is that unlike so there are surely hierarchies among horticultural societies, and there are hierarchies in hunter and gatherer societies. But in some ways, the hierarchies of inequality seem to be they're perhaps more maintained or easier to do in pastoral societies. Let's start with the wealth. Amanda, in a pastoral society, traditionally, what is wealth? Cows, the livestock, there they are looking at you. That would be equivalent to wealth. That's all you got, right? And so your money is your cows. Your whole life is wrapped up in your cows, your sheep, or your camels, right? And so in this environment, as they say, there's going to be a lot of ups and downs. One year you're doing great and your cows are reproducing and you're all getting all rich and happy. And then the next year somebody stole one of them and then one of them died and there's not enough food. And so there's a lot of fluctuation in these societies in terms of how much wealth people would have. But they say that in many of these societies, there is a greater opportunity because of this storable wealth, you might say, in cattle, that the richer families can afford more losses. So even if they're doing badly, they haven't swung low enough, and then they'll exploit the less wealthy, the poorer families within that community to work for them. And so oftentimes these relationships can become quite imbalanced within pastoral societies. Again, I should say that perhaps not as much as industrial societies, but nevertheless, there is this kind of swing and potential for inequality. I want to show you some of a film that was made around 1980, so it's a little bit dated. But it is about the Maasai, and especially from the perspective of the women. I was looking for a film that would be with the group that they discuss in here, which is the aerial pastoralists. This is kind of a nearby group. As you can see on the map, you have some Maasai land. In fact, they're probably more famous than the aerial. And so they're going to be slightly different, but share some characteristics. And I was thinking about this film, assuming you were talking about childcare and what people think about plural marriages, and this film just has a little bit of reflection on that from people in the society. So let's see what you think.